Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I want to welcome you to Insight. Now, Insight is a show where we discuss books on politics, domestically, internationally, sometimes historical books that provide a perspective on the present, sometimes broader atmospheric or trend analysis books. This is a book on international affairs, specifically dealing with the Middle East. It's written by Richard Engel, who is with NBC News, and the title of his book is titled, "And Then All Hell Broke Loose, 2 Decades in the Middle East." Now, joining me on the show today are 3 Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Jessie Basler. To Jessie's right is Jacob Bauer. And to Jacob's right is Kyle Kisner. Now, I wanted to read an opening quote from the book, and then we'll discuss sort of where he's coming from. The author writes, "Most of the nations of the Middle East can be divided into those with long histories and no oil, and those with lots of oil and very little history. With a few notable exceptions, both groups share a common feature. They were cobbled together by outsiders. It was the First World War that changed everything. The Middle East was reorganized, redefined, and the seeds were planted for a century of bloodshed. Palestine became the biggest problem, promised to the Jews as a homeland by the British without informing the Palestinian inhabitants that their farms and villages were part of the deal. The United States depended for decades on strong men to keep a volatile and religious region of rich governments in poor people in line and to keep the oil flowing. In the end, however, the big men were all undone by a fatal combination of their own poor management and the actions of two-term U.S. administrations, Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama."
I think the overall effect that really needs to be discussed is how the Middle East was pieced together completely by outsiders after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The borders were just created with no regards as to who lived there, what their style were, their religion, and things like that. And that created this chaos and this turmoil that actually led to these greater bloodsheds and things like that. And I think throughout the book, it's kind of represented the U.S.'s interference with the Middle East following this kind of piecing together that happened in the Middle East. And I think that's very volatile and important to the story of how this reporter went into this area and kind of started to understand these lines and these barriers and the relationships they had. And I think that it kind of represents our interference in the modern area that we always have in the Middle East and how that affects the relationships between these countries and these religions.
I mean, yeah, I think that goes to the nation states. The Middle East wasn't used to that. They were used to the Ottoman Empire and that kind of region just being together. And the whole idea of nation states was more of a Western idea, and they weren't used to that. And it like it said, the borders, it kind of divided them all up into ethnicities and nationalities and groups that they weren't used to, like working together. And I think the West doesn't really understand that it doesn't work for them. And we've kind of interfered continuously over time. And we seem to just kind of make things worse by interfering. So.
Well, the problems in the Middle East that are addressed in this opening paragraph of the book, as the author says throughout, are many thousands of years established, and it took a lot of years to get to this point. As Jessie stated, after World War I, you had a region that was already embroiled in some internal conflict following the fall of the Ottoman Empire, which at that point was acting as somewhat of a stabilizing force. The Allies began taking liberties with their freedoms, promising a homeland to Jewish people, and then the establishment of Israel after World War II against the will of the Palestinians. The U.S. relied on the stability provided by cruel dictatorships to keep the oil flowing, as the author says, and we propped them up with our own might and capital. When these unsturdy houses toppled, this released a lot of the volatility and things that we saw that Jessie suggested. And this was mostly done under the established battle cry, oftentimes of democracy, as was alluded to.
Well, when I'm looking at it, one, I think the problem is you're having this volatile region that seems like it's always been volatile, and it just was made worse in the sense that it wasn't the United States that really carved up the Middle East. If you're dealing with it after the First World War, it's very European. Second, I think Islam itself, because you won't have a creation where you separate church and state. And so he writes about the idea that Islam can't see a division between church and state. They're always the same. And then I think one of the third things he also sort of tries to address is that the way men and women get along in the Middle East is also a problem. And I notice he discusses that because he lived in different places in the Middle East. He talks about sort of his social interactions and some of the problems there.
Yeah. I definitely think that it is a time-honored dispute. It goes back about 13 centuries. The issue is that when the United States became involved following all these uprisings is that we made ourselves basically the policeman for the area. And that conflict between the Sunnis and the Shiites based on the Prophet of Allah and who is to lead and who is to not lead is based in the Islam tradition of that Islam is the guidelines for daily life. It's how people are supposed to interact. So they also view that as how government and politics should interact as well, because it's the overall guidelines for their entire lives. It shouldn't be just simplified to their daily life. It has a lot of misogynistic and patronal kind of cues and things like that. So women aren't really treated as equal. They're treated as more of items of lust and fear, and that kind of creates this fraternal brotherhood that he repeatedly brings up throughout the book and how men work together in these areas. But I think overall this conflict is time-honored, but the U.S. has made it worse by interfering with them giving the Shiites power, dissolving the Iraqi army. It kind of displeased the Sunnis and it just made the conflict worse, and they forced themselves into that middle of the Civil War. And I think that basically by us interfering consistently, we're just making things worse. Yes, it is a time-honored tradition of them having that conflict, but it typically just makes everything more volatile when we try to get involved to control them.
And going to what you said, that we think of it as an area of conflict, I mean, that's kind of really still young. It's only like the 100 years, like the past 100 years. Like 1,000 years ago, it was that region, the Middle East, was the center of civilization and culture. It was their golden age, much before like the Western Crusades kind of really undid all that for them and created that instability. So, and like with like regards to Islam, they do see it as like how they're supposed to live and how they're supposed to kind of like organize themselves. So there is that, like, not a definite separation of church and state, but I do think there is like a slight difference in how they operate, but they do live by kind of like the code of Islam and stuff.
Absolutely. He makes observations of how these various people in power actually use that indistinction between church and state sort of to their advantage. If you looked at a lot of the propaganda that Saddam's PR people were putting out, oftentimes they would make references to the Quran and things of that nature. When Iraq actually invaded Kuwait, one of the things that they tried to build it up as was some kind of a holy undertaking that they had to do, you know, to honor God. His time in the Middle East and with the Egyptians and things that you referred to, there's sort of a unspoken social things that he had to adhere to. You know, you're not allowed to look the women in the eye. You can't, in some regions, you can't see parts of their skin uncovered unless you're their husband, which he wasn't. He wasn't married at the time, so he wasn't able to have those interactions, which resulted in, as Jessie said, kind of a male-only club where, ironically, he did say that there didn't seem to be as much aggression in those circles, but obviously there was much aggression outside of that, stemming from the extremist disagreements that people had. Saddam Hussein, as awful as he was, did successfully smash a lot of those attempts at making any kind of trouble along Sunni or Shiite lines, even though his government wasn't exactly friendly to Shiites, which resulted in a lot of the hatred and things you saw kind of explode in Iraq after his regime was toppled.
Yeah, there's a quote he has in here, and so he talks about, I saw the big men at their prime, and then he says, I chronicled their downfall. And then he says, I suspect a new generation of big men will return. No people can tolerate chaos forever. Dictators will offer a way, and many of the exhausted and brutalized people of the Middle East will accept them, and I suspect Washington will as well. But then he refers to people like Bashar Assad, who is the father, and so Bashar Assad's father comes in, and that he, back in the 1980s, will massacre thousands of people, upwards of over 20,000 people of his own, to put down an uprising. And then Saddam Hussein ends up killing, and the way he puts it, over 100,000 people after the Gulf War of his own people to put down what he thinks is an uprising. So when I'm reading a quote like, someday the big men will return, I'm wondering, does that mean we're going to see some massive amount of bloodshed beyond the amount of bloodshed we're seeing now, say, in the Syrian War?
I think it relates back to Aristotle's theory of society and how if there's going to be chaos, there will always rise a dictator. We've seen it throughout history. When countries are in turmoil, especially post-war, there's always someone to come up and kind of calm the general public and their fears and things like that by taking full control. And back into Lockean theory, when people make those sacrifices and they see that as them receiving more power, even though they're losing lives or losing freedoms, they're gaining safety and they're willing to exchange that. The U.S. invasion and control would rather see these people in power that they could possibly control or extinguish rather than a united Islamic state that they would have no power over. And the issue with that is that it leads to this retaliation of these different groups as the U.S. continues to force this kind of ideal that the big man will rise again. And I think because we are kind of in peace talks right now with them and they're trying to organize their own thing, I think if we stepped back slightly and let them kind of create their own ideals and new regimes and things like that, it might retaliate in the same way that happened with Saddam Hussein, but I think that they might also have the possibility of them forming their own government that is working for them and not just us forcing our Western democracy onto it.
And again, you know, that he's trying to show that there's maybe more chaos to come, I get the feeling. Certainly when he starts to look at the Arab Spring, so then you end up having problems in Egypt, but then you have similar situations in Libya, the overthrow of a former strongman, and then he's particularly looking at Iraq because of then he's blaming George Bush for what he created. And he's saying, well, he may have gone in there with the idea of creating a democracy, but what he did was he really opened up, and he uses the term Pandoras Box. So.
Well, I mean, I forgot
Go
what I
ahead.
was saying.
Well, it's very interesting because to an extent, the moralism of the West definitely states that we're supposed to hate people like Saddam Hussein and Omar Gaddafi. But the problem is we depend on the resources that their economies produced. You saw right after the fall of Iraq and the conflict really began in the early 2000s in the Middle East, we saw oil prices start jumping up. I'm not saying those are directly related, but there's definitely some correlation there. Because of the fact that that region is now destabilized, there's no discernible economy. When the U.S. military went in, they didn't have a plan for establishing, well, we just took down Saddam Hussein's regime, we just took down the infrastructure, so how are we going to get the trash running on time? How are we going to get the utilities running to people's houses? And that resulted in just more squalor and chaos in that region. I have to think that just like the U.S., through the CIA and things of that nature, propped up and established the way that some of these regimes came into being, I have to believe at some point something of that nature will occur again.
Because, I mean, the United States did support a lot of those dictators and regimes at one point or another. They kind of propped them up, like you just said. And then it suited them, like, during the Arab Spring to suddenly support, like, their democracy and freedom and push for that. And with that Pandora's Box, like both the Bush and Obama administration, they really didn't have a handle and clear-cut idea of what they wanted to do in that region. And I think that only just led to more instability, and I think it only lead to more instability to come.
Well, I think he was also trying to point out that it wasn't necessarily the U.S. that led to the overthrow of these big men, but they were behind the eight ball.
Yeah.
Now they weren't completely sure what to do. So while he's critical of the Bush administration, the Obama administration, at the same time, they seemed to be caught off guard. I mean, it's apparent that Bush had no clue that suddenly what he was going to open up in the way of the Sunni Shiite problems, and that he keeps pointing out in the book that it was a complete illusion to assume there was any relationship between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda, that there's no darn way in the world that Saddam Hussein would have any relationship with al-Qaeda, and he uses a reference as al-Qaeda comes after Saddam Hussein, and then from that we get ISIS. And then same thing when he's talking about other situations. It's like it comes after. Now the U.S. is sort of not sure what to do.
I think definitely Pandora's Box was opened during Bush's Axis of Evil speech, when he basically said that we're not only going to retaliate against those who committed the acts of 9/11, but those who housed them. And it kind of created this unease amongst the Middle East because they had no idea who was going to come for who. And it created this rightful kind of sporadic conflict between all these different groups, because the retaliation from the U.S. invasion is basically what created al-Qaeda's thriving. That's where ISIS came from. They started in Iraq and moved to Syria because when the U.S. came to invade, they were trying to help. They were trying to bring democracy and stabilize it, but they also wanted that turmoil to remain so that they had access to the oil and the industries there. And by opening it, they basically wanted to help in that trade and stabilize the economy, but instead they just created massive conflict because they didn't know what they were doing. They had the good intentions, but the retaliations were extreme.
I sort of liked in the book where he talked about the Muslim Brotherhood, and in some ways his vision of them in Egypt particularly is that they're like a social welfare agency. They're this sort of a secondary government providing social services to people, and he sort of contrasts them with the idea of saying, here's this organization that's very Muslim or very Islamic, and at the same time they, like every other Islam organization, hate Jews. And he goes on to say they all have these cartoon images of being Jewish, but that's contrasted with al-Qaeda or ISIS. And so again, he's trying to sort of address, and you see different groups and sort of more complex ways than the idea of saying it's done in we're all just those groups that we all should hate every one of them. And he tries to sort of give a feeling that's not the way you should see it. One, certainly because as a journalist, when he was working his way up the line before he gets to NBC News, he had a lot of contacts with the Muslim Brotherhood and frequently wrote about them for the publications he wrote.
Yeah, he kind of sees them as they're more like social justice type people. They're angling for they want to get rid of this oppressive nature that's not allowing them to freely practice their religion and their culture. One of the things that Jessie alluded to a minute ago was that you have this sort of action-reaction pattern going on in the Middle East. You saw, once the Russians were ousted in Afghanistan, you saw the Taliban, which was made up mostly of Mujahideen fighters, which at one time were revered and celebrated by a lot of Muslims and a lot of people in the West for the fact that they were killing Russians.
He has this quote, "The big men let the Brotherhood," meaning the Muslim Brotherhood, "and extreme Wahhabi clerics pollute their people's minds. It kept them angry with the West, Israel, Washington, and an international American Zionist conspiracy instead of blaming their leaders for the nation's pathetic performance on the global stage. The Arab world of the big men was a deliberately stupid place." And so it's an interesting way of sort of an exploitation. Again, if he's saying someday these big men are going to return to bring some order, are they again going to exploit organizations to help themselves hide their own deficiencies.
Yeah. Throughout the author's interaction with the Brotherhood and different Muslim peoples throughout his country, he kind of understood them as almost a propaganda machine. When he met the Brotherhood, they instantly called him brother, they invited him to dine, they were very welcoming to the men that they needed to convince of their cause. And the thing behind that is they're always willing to educate people. Every time they saw someone on the street, they bring them in and say, brother, let me teach you about Islam and their beliefs and things like that. And so I think the big men kind of allow that to happen because it furthers their cause. The main cause of the big men were to destroy all Western ideals, because that's basically what they stand against, is that our theories of interaction with them and our tried involvement and control of them. And the Brotherhood actually stood against us in saying, this is Islam, this is our country, and this is what we want to re-establish the fundamentalist views of the Golden Age and things like that. And so the big men are most likely going to come back as long as these brotherhoods and these propaganda machines exist, because they're convincing the majority of people and the masses towards their cause.
But I think the Muslim Brotherhood, they kind of use their own version or own interpretations of Islam and tried to indoctrinate people to that version instead of, because they weren't really always allied like themselves with the big men and dictators, and a lot of times they kind of conflicted with them over like interests of the states and whatnot.
He breaks down even there. He'll take sort of, here's the Muslim Brotherhood, but then you have subsects. And that one is sort of very, almost like pacifists. And they want to just talk to you and figure the longer they talk, the more they somehow can convert you. Very different than this very violent group over here. And so this, and I think he's trying to present that as a way of saying, here's a failure that the United States fails to understand, is all these complex groups that they're not all, just because we define them as Islamic, we automatically should label them as terrorists. And so there's pages in here about pacifism of different Islamic groups.
Well, the interesting thing that you say is there's a fundamental difference, or just to jump off of something you said, there's a fundamental difference between being a Muslim, a practitioner of Islam, and an Islamist, or someone who pushes a more extreme form that is not necessarily in line with the teachings of the Quran. A lot of Islamists seek to purify Islam and bring about kind of a stricter, more refined version of Allah's word.
He says, the fundamentalism that I saw in my neighborhood was sexist and small-minded, but it wasn't violent. It was giving and loving and brotherly. It was about helping the poor, and since everybody was poor, that meant everybody helping everybody. That wasn't the kind of urban meanness you find in American cities. It was as if a farm community had been transplanted to the city. But then he contrasts that with, suddenly you're seeing a lot of bombings of tourists by terrorist groups in Egypt, and then he goes into the incredible violence, Sunni versus Shiite, that's going to develop in Iraq after the United States then topples Saddam Hussein. And so then he's sort of seeing all this interaction of these different groups.
I think his interactions are very chronological, as he starts in Egypt with these fraternal men that are very calm, and they are sexist and misogynistic, and he still views them as very small-minded and Eastern-bound, but he understands that they're peaceable people. And as we go through the different countries and the more turmoil as it's increasing in this area, you find those more extreme groups with the car bombings and the Bloody Sunday and things like that, and you find out as he kind of works his way through the more volatile areas, he can compare those to his continuous fraternal experience when he first started in Egypt. And it is important that we distinguish between these groups, that not all Muslims are terrorists, not all Islamists are terrorists. It's different groups that have different varying ideas, and those fundamentalists is the grand idea that they're all trying to regain the vigor that they had back in the time before U.S. intervention, the Ottoman Empire fell. But I think the U.S. is kind of hurting that cause by claiming that they're all the same and not understanding these different groups. But he kind of hurts his own opinion and argument by introducing these extremist groups towards the end of the book and kind of forgetting about those fraternal values.
He's got a quote I like: from a Muslim perspective, modern wars launched by Christian powers into Islamic lands are considered crusades because they reflect the same basic East versus West, Islam versus Christianity power struggle. And so he's sort of interesting way that he's sort of saying you can almost see the past and the present. And so there's sort of still the same sort of a problem. Now, we only have a few minutes left, so what did you think of the book, and do you recommend it to people watching this show?
Personally, I understood his viewpoints as a reporter, as a white male United States citizen. I think that he kind of unfairly represented a lot of the different groups because he didn't fully experience them. He did have interactions with them. Overall, I found the book very informative. It did give me a lot of background on the situation and the multiple players. And the big idea, I think I would have preferred a different scope, someone from the area who actually understands the little details of the situation rather than an outsider giving me my perspective. He was very anecdotal, so it's a very personable book. It's easy to read, it's easy to understand. You feel like you understand the author very well, but for me it's a little too personal.
I thought he did a good job kind of explaining the area and whatnot, but I think the problem is that he wasn't really living there. He was more of a tourist. He could come and go as he pleased, and so he could escape a lot of like the danger and stuff, while others in that area are kind of like they're stuck there and forced to live there, and he didn't really get to experience that like firsthand. Like he was like used to like car bombing and stuff, but he could leave when he wanted. He could get out while others are trapped there and living in that kind of area. But overall, I think he does kind of share the struggles of that area. So.
I enjoyed the book to a certain extent because there was some an element of familiarity when he was covering the areas of Iraq. I did get a chance to travel around Iraq a little bit, mostly by helicopter, but it was kind of refreshing to see him kind of go over some of just the general culture. I still felt, however, that his observations were mostly on the surface, and that, as Jessie pointed out, maybe he didn't quite get down deep enough as perhaps you would hope someone spending that much time in the Middle East would be able to with some of these different groups. However, as was pointed out, he definitely did a great job of giving significant background and information, which allowed us to more carefully understand the kind of the root causes of why things are so messed up over there right now.
Since the book is only 200 pages and a quick overview, I guess I can understand that he couldn't go into depth, otherwise it becomes a 400-page book. And so in that sense, I can grasp sort of some of what he's doing. And I guess the weakness is was very critical of the Bush administration. I could see it through the Iraq War. I couldn't quite figure out. I know he didn't seem to like the Obama years, but I couldn't quite sense from the book, maybe develop that over a few more pages about, I'm not sure what it was the Obama administration should have been doing as these strong men are being overthrown. I'm not quite sure there. So a quick, though, book to sort of give you some sense of some of the complexities. So in that sense, I'd at least recommend reading it. Thank you for joining us today.